This is the story of a lover's triangle. I suppose you say Arnie Cunningham, Late Cabot, and of course, Christine. But I want you to understand that Christine was first. She was Arnie's first love, and while I wouldn't presume to say for sure, not from whatever heights of wisdom I have obtained in my 22 years anyway, I think she was his only true love. So I call what happened a tragedy. Christine came out roaring onto the highway of horror in 1983, and in my opinion, she was the one who definitely cemented Stephen King as America's boogeyman. He was certainly gaining the title when Cujo became to the go name for mean dogs, and Here's Johnny could equally mean Johnny Carson or Jack Torrance. But I think it was Christine the one who really got him to shine, as with her, he managed to do something he had only sort of hinted at it in an early short story called Trucks. Make an object both terrifying and alive. Because while a lot of people would say later that a self-driving car is not really that scary, Christine is terrifying. And I don't mean the book. I mean the mean lady herself. The 1958 red Plymouth Fury that will either run you over or give you a ride straight to hell. Christine is also the first full book mostly written in first person for King. We have had some chapters in this particular style in Carrie, mostly the survivor's account, but other than that, it seems King doesn't particularly like to let his protagonists to be the narrators that often. It may be because it sort of robs him of his favorite trick, the foreboding foreshadowing of evil yet to come, or just because, no particular real reason. The result is that whenever he actually does it, it's a lot easier to get attached to the narrator. I know that Dennis is among my favorite King survivors, and that may be because we get to know how much he loved his friends and hated Christine from his own mouth. And here's the funny thing too. Christine, out of the early King books, is the least affected by misinformation. Everyone who has heard the name knows it's a name to run away from fast. That Christine is an evil car, possibly possessed, jealous and clingy, and they are all right. To borrow a term from anime, Christine is a yandere, and God help you if you get between her and her chosen man. I'm Annalisa Zarate, and I hope you want to hitch a ride with me today as we discuss love, cars, and rock and roll in Stephen King's Christine. King's star was bright in 1983, so bright that John Carpenter's Christine, the movie based on the book, began production before the book was actually published, and they knew if the public would love her as much as they loved King's previous books. And it worked out well, despite that at the time the movie was not precisely a blockbuster. Nowadays it's a cult movie, and the car that King chose to be his leading lady went from an almost forgotten car, something that is mentioned even in the book, to a complete classic that everyone knows as the 50s car, almost as much as the other non-50s 50s car, the Grease Lightning. Still, the darkness and cruelty that had started to show in Cujo continues to creep forward in Christine. And if you thought Cujo was brutal, you don't know what's up the road when traveling with this femme fatale. As the opening statement says, Christine is a love story. A tragedy, like many love stories are, especially when a triangle is involved, even if one part of the triangle isn't human. Arnie Cunningham was the biggest loser in high school, face filled with craters and pimples, living under his parents' thumbs, a complete and absolute nerd whose biggest sport activity was chess, and bullied by everyone who ever met him except for his best friend, Golden Boy Dennis Gilder, who couldn't be more different. Dennis was handsome, popular, a rising football star, even if he didn't like the sport that much. No one got why they were friends, but they had been thick as thieves since kindergarten, and absolutely nothing could come between them if you asked Dennis. Until the day Arnie sees Christine for the first time. That day, she wasn't much to look at. Rusted, grill and glass broken, radio antenna looking like an accordion. The tires were in their literal last threads, and Dennis was pretty sure there was an oil stain on her hair that proved that the radiator was shot. Anyone would have sold her for parts and still robbed the buyer. But Arnie fell in love hard and practically begged the owner, a horrible man named Ronald LeBay, to let him buy her, despite the "for sale" sign in her windshield. Arnie was convinced he could restore Christine to her former beauty, and nothing, not his parents' complaints or Dennis' warnings that old cars can be money burners, would make him change his mind. Dennis, for his part, was very concerned about Arnie's obsession with what Dennis called a piece of crap. And he was right to be, because as soon as it happens, he started seeing less and less of Arnie, who spent most of his time at Will Darnell's garage, a place where he could work on Christine and earn some extra money running some errands for the owner. Errands that, Dennis fears, may not be completely legal. But Arnie still does that as it gives him money to spend on Christine's restoration. And then something strange begins to happen. As Christine starts looking better, far better than she should with the time Arnie had spent on her, so does Arnie. The seeds disappear. He starts walking a bit straighter, at least until he mysteriously hurts his back and ends up with the exact limp Levey used to have. And finally, he even gets a girlfriend. A human one this time, the popular newcomer Late Cabot. But Arnie is still the target of bullies. In particular, a classmate called Buddy Repperton. And when Buddy takes his volleying one step higher and trashes Christine, something even weirder happens. As Arnie manages to repair Christine faster than anyone would have thought possible, one of Buddy's gang's mates is killed in a mysterious crash and burn. And that makes Dennis like Christine even less and less as the bodies start piling on the highway. With Christine, we have a return to some of King's staple characters that we had missing in Cujo. For example, while not as famous as Margaret White, Regina Cunningham is also a very nasty brand of possessive mother. It's easy to forget that, since she is definitely not the worst woman in Arnie's life, and her end is quite tragic. But she was opposed to Arnie having a car and a girlfriend, not because she had bad feelings about Christine, but because buying the car was the first time Arnie went against her wishes. And we get a picture that she was a very controlling and abusive and emotionally abusive woman, not only to her son, but also to her husband and her co-workers. But what is more interesting about Christine is how it dissects masculinity, both toxic and healthy, and men's relation not just to their cars and their women in their lives, but to society itself, long before toxic masculinity became a buzzword. Let's start with the healthy masculine characters in the book, because we will get really dark later. Dennis Gowler is, of course, our first example. In paper, he's the perfect American guy. The star quarterback who has his life set for him not because he's particularly smart, although he is, and by the end of the book we find out that he gave up sports and became a teacher, which is yet another King's staple, but because he's a great athlete and very likable. Sure, he has his few enemies, but that's mostly due to his loyalty to Arnie and his refusal to join the bully circle. Teachers like him, parents most of the time love him. The only time he has a disagreement with the Cunninghams is when Regina wrongly blames Dennis for Arnie buying Christine, and later the Cabots blame him for Lake's wounds at the end of the book, but they do end up forgiving him. But as great as he is, he knows he's not perfect. At the end of the first third of the book, he suffers a horrible career-ending injury on the football field. One of the very few accidents in the book that cannot be blamed on Christine, although one could make the case that she distracted him long enough so that he couldn't avoid the other players, and ends up laying in a hospital bed for most of the murders. And in that time, he gets to think about how he was playing football, not so much because he enjoyed it, but because it was expected of him. While before he had had some insights on how badly he and his father treat his mother's dream of becoming a writer, another King's staple, and his own discomfort at his sister growing up and the way he treated his girlfriends as just that pretty girl that he hanged up because he was supposed to have a pretty girl at his side, it's in the hospital where he falls in love with Lee. And he's quite clear on how that makes him a rotten friend to Arnie. Because even if he doesn't make a move on Lee until after she breaks up with him, with Arnie I mean, and Arnie was quite insane by that time thanks to Christine and Levey's influence, Dennis still doesn't give himself a pass. He knows it's wrong to want his best he knows it's wrong to want his best friend's girlfriend, and that making a move on her when she's vulnerable because of the breakup will make her love him. But it's manipulative and wrong. To be honest, at one point, I wondered if it was necessary to make Dennis want Leigh, because why add that particular edge to the triangle if we had enough problems between Christine, Arnie, and Leigh? But yet, Dennis' inner monologue, not just about Leigh, but about Roseanne, his previous girlfriend, and the cheerleader, the girl between Roseanne and Leigh, makes him more relatable. The fact that not only he didn't end up with Leigh, but also went to her wedding to another man who drove a Honda Civic, no problems there, and was self-aware enough to realize that his relationship with Leigh was mostly driven by the horror they lived through and their mutual love for Arnie, makes him even more interesting, because he even admits that in another kind of story, a fictional one, yes, the broken-legged knight would have gotten the princess. Another wholesome man in the book, who was badly misrepresented in the movie, is George LeBay, Ronald LeBay Younger's brother. He had the exact same upbringing that Ronald. Made it worse because George was the first target of Ronald's unending rage long before Christine appeared in the picture. And yet, George didn't come out like his brother. In fact, the second time he appears, we find out that not only he's also a teacher, he's an author as he's finishing a novel. George is also quite a rational man who hates his brother Scar and yet doesn't hesitate much to tell the whole story to a strange teen, Dennis, just in order to help the kid try to save his friend. George shows that no, there is no excuse for a man to end up like Ronald, not if he doesn't want to, and that makes his impact on the narrative even more strong, even if he doesn't appear more than 2 times in the whole book. There are the parents, of course, Michael for Arnie and Kenny for Dennis, but their participation is quite small, so let's move on. Unfortunately, the bad examples of men, who now with completely called toxic, are way too many to go in detail one by one among the important ones. There are greats, of course, with poor Bobby Stanson being the lesser evil, mostly because he was a guy who only had the bad luck of hanging with Buddy and his gang on the day Christine wanted her revenge, becoming mostly an example of what happens with peer pressure, and on the other end of the spectrum, Ronald LeBay as the worst example of an abusive personality and anger, wrapped on the excuse of "this is how men are," with Christine as his main enabler. But let's analyze this through Arnie's devolution from a normal, if lonely nerd, to full-blown psychopath who wanted even his best friend and his ex-girlfriend dead for betraying him and being like all the other shitters. Now, I know there's a lot of people who think Arnie himself didn't change, that he was being possessed by LeBay, something that is also believed by Dennis and sort of confirmed by the way in which Arnie acts when talking to Dennis one last time, claiming that LeBay is always here, except and the witness that swears he saw 3 people in the car when Regina and Arnie died. But I am not 100% sure, since there is one tiny scene in the book when we find that even LeBay is afraid of Christine. Whatever possessed Arnie, it might also have possessed LeBay, even if LeBay was not particularly nice before. In the words of George LeBay, "My brother was evil, but he wasn't a monster. At least, I don't think he was before." Of course, it may also be that Christine just enhanced the evilness and anger that was already there in the case of LeBay and decided to mold Arnie into a copy of her ideal man. Whichever is the case, the first very noticeable change in Arnie that is not physical is his anger. While some of it could be completely understandable after a life of bullying and being told that his choices in life only matter as long as they line up with his mother's, the way in which he starts referring to anyone who upsets him as shitters and almost kills Buddy with his fist for breaking Christine's light is a bit too much. Especially as that particular incident happens before Buddy goes all out on bullying Arnie, and even before LeBay dies. In fact, adding to the idea that Christine repairs herself out of the life energy of her drivers It is implied that LeBay died because the light was broken. But when he gets to first abandoning Lade with a hitchhiker because he was mad at her, and later assaulting the man because he saved Lade's life, that's impossible to justify. The way he treats Dennis, even as Dennis is trying to help, yelling and cursing and even threatening to kill him if he looks under Christine's hood, is definitely out of the question. And by the last confrontation, when he kicks Dennis' crutches away, risking breaking Dennis's legs again, well, Arnie is definitely in the asshole club. This anger is, of course, mirrored with what we know about LeBay, who almost killed his own brother when he was a teen, even before going to war. However, as far as we know, LeBay never directly killed anyone outside the war, which was pre-Christine anyway. He did let his daughter die, probably as an instinctive sacrifice to whatever Christine is, and probably killed his wife and made it look like a suicide. It is heavily implied that that was what happened, and though Michael Cunningham's death also could imply that it was Christine herself who did the deed, but he wasn't running down the people on the streets with the car when he was alive. Christine was evil, yes, but as far as we know, she only started racking bodies with Arnie. Did Arnie's anger fuel LeBay? Or was LeBay's anger just an excuse for Arnie to go full psychopath and let his darker side come in? It is hard to tell, because most of the novel is told by Dennis, and Dennis, despite it all, loves Arnie and will excuse most of the things his friends did, happily blaming LeBay and Christine for the actual murders. But then there's Arnie's obsession with Leigh. And again, while Dennis tries to blame LeBay for it, it's harder to make the case that it wasn't Arnie's darker impulses at work there. Because yes, LeBay murdered Veronica, his wife, and then kept her under his thumb until she died. But there were moments, mostly pre-Christine, where you could see that Veronica had some say in the relationship, to the point that if it wasn't for her, Levi would have never been able to save enough money to buy Christine, paying a 10% deposit, then the rest falling cash, just like Arnie would do years later. But once Arnie decides he wants Leigh stops being a person to him. Sure, at first the relationship is very nice, and Dennis is jealous but at the same time relieved that Arnie has someone to love, that it's not metallic and maybe demonic. But after Leigh almost dying the same way that Rita, Levi's daughters, did, Leigh gives Arnie an ultimatum. Either he gets rid of Christine or they throw. And Arnie doesn't care. He decides that he's hysterical, that the breakup is just a small fight, that she really didn't mean, and that they're going to get married and move to California where he's going to work fixing cars. The fact that she doesn't want to see him anymore, she doesn't reply to his phone calls, that she wants to study college and become a teacher, that's just something he has to correct her about. And doesn't that sound horribly familiar to many, many, many stories of abusive husbands? Arnie even claims that Dennis and Leigh betrayed him by going out with Dennis after they broke up. An idea that Dennis shared, but Leigh doesn't. She only wants to hide the relationship because she's afraid of how Christine will react, but never thinks she did something wrong. And this is, again, an idea very common to abusive partners. A woman is a man's possession, and even if they are not together, the bro code means that you don't date your friend's girlfriend because she's always his girlfriend even if they broke up. And yes, I realize that I am making Arnie sound a lot like an incel, but that's because he becomes one. Christine is a terrifying book in many ways. If you are a parent, it will hit the buttons of fearing seeing your children become complete strangers as they grow up. The fear of losing friendships to romance or bad influences is one that goes for all ages. And yes, fears of hit and runs also work because, let's be honest, we don't know what kind of crazy, or drunk, or both people are behind the wheel. If you are a car lover, it may be a bit hard to get into because King is very, very critical of car culture and how some people tend to treat their cars better than they treat other people, even without getting to the same extremes that Ronald and Arnie go to. The movie is not that faithful to the book, but John Carpenter always delivers a good horror punch, so I must recommend both to you. They are also certainly 1,000 times more beginning-friendly than Cujo, that is for sure. I want to thank my dear patrons, Kaiser Carranza, Mitch Hyman, Elaine Ho, and Jessica, as well as my first supporter, Tanya Pineda. I also want to remind you that if you want to support these and my other projects and get your name mentioned here, you can do so at patreon.com/Adalisa. Written link on descriptions, as I know my name is hard to spell. And with just $1 a month, you will always be thanked in my videos, as well as get access to a ton of art before anyone else. If you can't support me that way, I also accept likes, subscriptions to the channel, comments so the algorithm catches some engagement, and of course, sharing the links. I will also welcome all your questions, comments, and suggestions in the comment section below. And I hope to see you here next month when we will explore grief, loss, and that weird place in the Pet Semetary, way past the branches on the Creed's property, as we visit the Pet Semetary.